Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Zach Jones, and I'm with the Sealaska Heritage Institute. And it's really my pleasure to welcome everyone to the Sealaska Heritage Institute's Native American Heritage Month. We're grateful each year to continue this lecture for our support and for all those people who come out and are able to learn here as we work in real time, and those who will be able to view it in the future as we place it online. It's a great opportunity. Before I have the opportunity to introduce our speaker, I wanted to acknowledge our sponsors. Of course, the Sealaska Heritage Institute, the Sealaska Corporation, and ConocoPhillips of Alaska. The Heritage Institute, as a nonprofit, is always grateful for the support that we receive. With that said, it's really my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Today we have the pleasure of having Delores Churchill speak to us. She's a master Haida weaver, and I think I probably could spend too much time speaking about all the good work she has done, her time giving to communities, and her experience as an artist. It's just our real pleasure to have her speak with us today. She's going to speak today about art revival in Southeast Alaska. And with that said, I'd like to turn the time over to Delores, and I'd ask everyone to welcome her. Thank you.
Hada laas, di kero ilskiala sukunu di kyang, di au ilskile kun kya, di hatus kilgyang sukunu lasen kyagan, gitiu au gitens hadagan. My name is Delores Churchill in English, and I won't translate because we don't have that much time, and I have so many slides, and some of these slides are like from the British Museum, some from the National Museum in Washington, D.C., the Canadian Museum of Civilization. And I don't think I'm going to be able to get through it in an hour, and I know some of you here are just doing here during your lunch, so I'm going to start right out with the slides. I put this one on first because my stepfather, George Peratrovich, was one of the people who started the singing and dancing in Ketchikan. Actually, I was going to high school when I got a call. I was doing homework and I got a call from my stepdad. He said, "Could you bring my drum down?" They were doing ballroom dancing at the A&B A&S Hall. So I brought the drum down and I sat down to watch what was happening. And Joe Johnson, he stood up and he said, "We've been doing this white people's dancing for too long. We better do our own dancing." And so it was really amazing because there were Tsimshian, Haidas, Tlingits, and they would laugh so hard. They were laughing through the whole first practice because they were remembering old songs. They were remembering stories about their relatives. It was so amazing to be there. This was in 1946. And so there were and you'll see that the regalia was not really like they are right now, but they're still precious because they were the first ones. Whoops. Then that's the group that started it. There's George Keegan. I don't know if he was Tlingit or Tsimshian. And then my stepdad was drumming. And then Joe Johnson, who actually was the one who stood up and said, "We better start doing our own dancing." And it had been against the law for our people to do any kind of dancing. So this was a really brave movement of these people. Those were the first people to dance in Southeast Alaska. And they had so much fun. I used to have to go watch them just because it was so much fun watching them and able to understand what they were doing. And this is another man who was instrumental in reviving the art of carving His name is Robert Davidson. That's Robert Davidson's grandfather. And the pole standing there on the right-hand side is a pole that was carved by Robert and his grandfather, Robert Davidson. And I'll never forget going and watching them carving together. There was no conversation, and yet when his father needed a tool, Robert knew which tool, and he was so young, but he'd know which tool his grandfather needed, and he'd hand it to him. And there's no conversation. But that's how we used to be. I remember coming back from the city and saying hi, hello to people, and everybody would just look at me, because in the village, when you met somebody, you just nodded. You did not say hello. You did not say hi. So we've really lived through a tradition of being very quiet. We sure aren't quiet now. And this is at the pole raising, and you can see that even Robert Davidson, that's over there in the foreground, his regalia is not that fancy. It's amazing how it has changed. And I wanted you to see these that my mother made, and people are showing them. And they didn't, like the eagle's beak is down, but the bear doesn't really look like a bear. But it was really amazing how it started transforming, because there's Nathan. And when Nathan stepped into the picture, you can see my mother's beaver blanket, and it's still being danced. There was such a complete change when the artists got involved. They really made a very big difference, and it's amazing to see the new regalia. And there's my mother teaching. And as she was teaching, she this was in Ketchikan at the Totem Heritage Center, but they were already recognizing that this art was making a revival, and this petition was given to my mother at the Nelson Gallery in Kansas City in honor of her keeping on and teaching this tradition. Patty, could I have you read? I'm going to have Patty read something that has to do with this presentation.
The theme of the Alaska Native Brotherhood's 53rd Annual Convention in 1965, Resolution Number 36, pledged the Brotherhood to encourage all camps to assist in recording legends, songs, and other data to preserve in written record our heritage. Cyrus Peck asks, do you hear the whisper of your father, of your uncles? Their example is close to us. It is in the air. It is in the spirit. It is our birthright and heritage. As the people were vigilant and brave in the battles of the past, he said, let us be brave in meeting the challenges of today.
So you could see everyone was really getting to see what was happening. It was really an exciting time. Weavers, carvers, they all were starting to get excited about this new movement in the arts. And Frida Deasing was the first, she was my cousin, and she was the first Haida woman carver. And that's her great-grandmother on the right-hand side, and she's the smallest one with her grandfather and grandmother in Inverness. I didn't have a picture of her, and I'm really sorry, so I had to use these. But she really was instrumental and was one of the first teachers at the Totem Heritage Center that taught design, carving design. And Dennis Demmert and Jane, his wife, were really important to the movement of this, the basketry and the totem pole renovation, because Jane was working at the museum, and she had my mother teach basketry at the museum. That's where she first started teaching. In fact, Jane called her a few times and asked her, why don't you come visit us? Well, Mother didn't realize she was asking her to teach weaving. And she went up there to visit, and Jane said, "Where's your material?" And so Mother called me, and I had to mail the material to her. And Dennis, he was in Ainby, Ainess in Ketchikan. And as he went out into the old villages, and he saw that these totem poles were being taken away by non-natives, and he became very afraid that they were all going to be gone in a short time. And so he talked to Jane, and she got the state involved, and so they retrieved these totem poles that were salvageable in the old villages. But before that, in 1929, Ketchikan, without the native permission, took 3 totem poles from 3 different villages and put them in the city park. But this time, Dennis went to all the native tribes and talked to them. And amazingly, a lot of them felt that they should rot in the woods, just like they did a long time ago. They felt that they wanted to honor what their ancestors did. But Dennis kept talking to them and telling them how important it was to remember what we had, that we would not, that pictures never do it justice, that you needed to, the young people had to study the poles. So he convinced them, and that's how that came about, that the Totem Heritage Center then put the poles in the Heritage Center. When I was teaching with, or working with my mother, you see how scraggly I look. She always looked elegant. She even wore high heels when she was harvesting cedar bark or spruce. And when I was learning, I really didn't stop learning. I just kept working with this Tsimshian woman that I wove with. She had me do a mat, and it was a cedar bark mat, and I never did one before, so it was kind of fun working with her and having her show me how to do Tsimshian weaving. I was so interested in basketry that I couldn't just, when Flora Mather was in my mother's first class that I took with my mother, and Flora was weaving right side up, Haida's weave upside down. And it really made more sense to me to weave right side up. So I said to Flora Mather, "Would you help me learn Tsimshian weaving?" And she said yes. So I started this basket at the bottom with a Tsimshian lightning design because she was really instrumental in helping me learn to do Tsimshian weaving. But that's a Dora Bolton design. That's David Boxley's grandmother. She didn't speak English. She understood English. But when I was learning this design, I really just had to sit there and watch her doing it because there was no conversation. But she was a good teacher. The next design was Tlingit. And I have just the 3 colors because when I was with Jenny Clanot and I showed her this design, she said it wasn't in, her clan did not call it the shaman hat design. She said it represented the seasons on the mountain because she said after the snow came, the flowers were already blooming under the snow. So when it melted, there was no spring. There was just winter, summer, fall. So that's why, by honoring her and listening to her stories, I decided I would just leave it that way. Then before I started weaving, I was in Vancouver recovering from surgery, and I was watching this woman, Coast Salish woman, weaving, and for some reason she didn't want me to watch. It was just weird. Every time I came close, she'd quit. So I had to go up and near the top of the totem poles and look down and watch her. But that's how I learned to do this Coast Salish weaving. So you need to use all different methods. And then I put the Haida design on top because, you know, I thought, you know, I'm Haida, I'll put it on the top. And the black bands represent Haida weaving. The museum in Anchorage just bought it recently. It's on display this month in Anchorage. But I'd also like to talk about the basket that's in the foreground. It was in the museum in Indianapolis until just a few months ago. You know, that's a seaweed basket, and when I was a child and we went out to get seaweed, the Haidas felt the seaweed was so important. Children could not touch seaweed, not even when it was drying. Only the adults took care of the seaweed. Because I never knew until I started studying about seaweed that the seaweed we have in the Pacific Northwest, only the males survived. You know, usually females are the ones that survive, but in the seaweed family, the adults, only the males survive. So if you denude a rock of its seaweed, it won't come back. I was really starting to weave a lot, and this is 1% commission that the state of Alaska gives 1% commission for art. And this one is at the Ketchikan High School, and that's my granddaughter wearing the red cedar bark robe. It's the only one that's in the United States. The rest are in Great Britain, because I finally found out why nobody is doing that now. You'd have to do it dry, because if you wet it, it shrinks. So you have to weave with it dry. And the slivers get in your fingers, and you have to rest them for 2 or 3 days before you could weave again. It took me forever. And I said, I'll never do it. In fact, a collector called me and actually offered me $50,000 to do one. I said, no, never, never, never. That was the end of it. And my daughter Holly weaves a lot, and she did that apron. And I did that apron when I was weaving with Cheryl Samuel. When I was at the British Museum, this was before I was really interested in raven's tail or Chilkat weaving. I just was intrigued with these robes that were there, that were collected by Captain Cook. And it was interesting to see that if you see the eyes where it would be circles, they're square. And it was really exciting, but I'll keep going. And these are the pictures I took then. And then these, you know, when you see pictures, you can't always, this was pictures that were on postcards. And here they are Haidas. They're listed as Tlingit on the postcards, but they're actually Haida men, Haida chiefs with their regalia. And when you think of Chilkat, the main reason that Chilkat evolved was because the weavers learned to make a circle from a square, and that's what that is. And it really, from that moment on, Chilkat was possible, because raven's tail is all geometric. They went from raven's tail to Chilkat. There I am taking my first class. You know, when I came back from Britain, I had received a $5,000 grant from the State Council on the Art to study Haida baskets in Great Britain. So I traveled all over Great Britain studying the collections. When I came home, Nathan's wife, Dorica, called me and said, Cheryl Samuels is coming to teach a class in Chilkat weaving. I said, look, my brain can't take any more learning, so I am not taking that class. Then she said, well, I'll know more than you do. And I said, okay, I'll take the class. So then I was weaving, I think right about then, I was weaving Chilkat. And I went to Cheryl, I said, I can't sleep, I can't eat. It's like I'm in love. So will you take me as an apprentice? And she did. And Ernestine also apprenticed under her, and we went to Victoria and studied with her. These are some of the, this is a robe that's at the Canadian Museum of Civilization. And the reason I show this is because The one on the left-hand side shows it finished, you know, the finished look. The one on the inside shows how much they added. You know, if I had known that how much you could learn from the wrong side of a garment, I would have studied the wrong side or taken pictures of the wrong side of those garments in Great Britain. I don't know how they were made now because I didn't do those. Someday I'm going to have to go back and take pictures of the wrong side. But that's a really important part of Chilkat weaving, is to know what happens on the inside. And also by now I'm learning that you just don't look at the outside, you have to look at every part of it and to study the side braids. I mean, you wouldn't know that there were 2 rows looking at the robe, that there are 2 pieces on the side braids. In fact, when I was doing the side braids on an apron, I called Jenny Clenott and I said, you know, I'm reading the Chilkat weaving book, but I can't quite understand how to do the side braids. And she said, do you know how to think backwards? I said, what? She said, think forward and backwards. Don't think one way. And that was really interesting, because she said, if you go over on the front, you go under in the back, and they'll both be the same. And incredibly, and she said, it's divisible by 3. It's 2, 1, 2, 1. She said, you could do it. And I was able to do it. It was amazing, just from a telephone conversation and her telling me the trick to doing it. And again, I'm showing how important it is to see the right side and the wrong side. And you see how it has faded. In fact, I saw a robe hanging in a museum, I can't remember which one, where it was the wrong side that was showing. They didn't know that the faded one was actually the right side. And this really tells you, you can see that the circles are rectangular in this one. See how they are? But when you look at the other side, they're ovoid, they're round. So really, it was really important to be able to study the wrong side of robes as well as the front. And there were so many different ways to do faces. I thought that you might want to see these, and you see the back part of the one that has the, I don't think that's the same one. I think that's another from a robe. But anyway, it shows you how, by studying these, and they have added to the teeth, and you could see that when they were doing that.
Is that like a labre in the top left?
Yeah, I think that was a labrette, yeah. And this is the robe in one piece, and it's an incredible robe. If you ever have a chance to study it, it's at the Canadian Museum of Civilization. And I thought you might want to see what Elena looks like. She's the one that does the spinning of our warp. So those of us who hire someone to do the spin. She was as small as her sister Silvina is when she first started spinning. In fact, one time, I guess, when she was in school, she had to go to the washroom, and she said to the teacher, I have to pee, I have to pee, but because my mother's dying. And the teacher said, what does your mother dying have to do with your pee? And so Silvina had to explain that she actually was dyeing material and she needed the urine for her project. I thought you'd like to see this beautiful Chilkat robe. And when I was studying at the Canadian Museum of Civilization, I found that my father had sold 75 hats and hundreds of baskets to the Canadian Museum of Civilization. And when I looked at this basket, I was really surprised because one of my cousins has one that my grandmother made, and it was exactly like this. So I think that museum piece was my grandmother's. So it's really exciting when you find something that belonged to a relative or was made by a relative. And my mother always has been my inspiration. And like I said, she always dressed so elegant, and I loved working with her. She was very strict, though. You know, she burned my baskets for 5 years, but she sold my daughters right away, my daughter April. But I guess she really was a better weaver than I was, because she has a basket in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and I don't. So I guess my mother recognized a very good weaver. There's some more of her baskets. And you know, the reason I'm showing this weaving of these European family that are weavers is I used to go to Martha's Vineyard when my daughters lived there and was married there. And I bought the Boston Globe, because you couldn't fly from Boston to Martha's Vineyard in those years, because they didn't have that technology to fly at night. So I would have to spend the night in Boston. Well, I bought the Boston Globe. Of course, I went right to the art page. And there was an article by Joel Adavasio, and he's an anthropologist and studies basketry. And in that article, he wrote that when humans came out of caves, and one of the first things they learned to do, and that allowed them to leave the caves, was basketry. Because they could make thatched roof, they could make clothing, they could make containers to harvest berries and many different things. So I really was amazed when I read that. Then from Boston, I was going to Toronto, where I was working, demonstrating and teaching weaving at Basketry Focus. And when I got there, there were weavers from all over the world. There were people from Peru, there were people from Japan, Taiwan, Norway, Germany. There were people from all over the world. And it made me realize that weaving was in all of civilization and made a big impact. And then at that gathering in Toronto, there was a Japanese weaver, and he wanted us all to be united with one another. And so he had us all donate fabric for this weaving, and children and adults, anybody in the community could come and work on it. So it turned out to be a really exciting project. And I used to be really kind of cautious about who I taught, but my mother never was. She always felt that basketry was important, so to everyone. And so then I got a grant to teach. I was hoping she would be here, Rachel Barth. She got an apprenticeship grant to work under me. But she's really a unique weaver, because she doesn't weave traditional weaving like I taught her. You can see she does all kinds of very unique weaving. And I think that that's important too. I think that traditional weaving is wonderful, but I also like these modern pieces that some of the people that learned under me are doing now. My mother just didn't stop learning either. There was a very wealthy woman who came to Haida Gwaii when my mother was there, and she and Florence Davidson were with this woman who was a collector. And this collector really wanted to study Chilkat weaving and see it, because she heard it was a dying art. Well, my mother knew Annie Lawrence, and she knew Annie Lawrence did Chilkat weaving. So this wealthy collector chartered a plane, and my mother and Florence went to visit Annie Lawrence. And when they went to Annie Lawrence's home, Annie said, "Oh, I had a visitor yesterday. It's wonderful that I have new visitors today." And Mother said, "Who was your visitor yesterday?" And she said, "A brown bear." She said, "I was cooking, and I went into my front room, and I heard some movement in the kitchen, so I went there, and here was a bear." And she said, I said to him, "Brother, I'm very happy to see you, but I think you're not welcome anymore. You better leave." And the bear turned around and walked out of her house. The weaving continues from a long time ago. This basketry hat that is in front of my sister-in-law, Primrose, was woven by her grandmother, Isabel, and her grandfather, Charles Edenshaw, painted the hat. But those are her skill hat and her other hat that she wove. I think Sealaska bought that hat. But she did some beautiful weaving. She's still weaving and does beautiful work. That's another one of her grandfather's painted hats that her grandmother wove. And that one, I think my father sold that one in 1929. I think that's a family heirloom because it has an eagle, beaver, frog, and sculpin. And the sculpin is inside. And my father didn't hesitate to sell things when he was, because he wanted Native Brotherhood and Native Sisterhood to have a good start. So he was, I think that was one of the reasons he was selling all these articles that he bought to the museum, because he was really fighting to get the Native people to be able to vote. And in Canada, they didn't even get to vote till 1968. And Isabel Rorick is one of my mother's first apprentices. Well, April was the first, but Isabel was also learned right afterwards. And when Isabel came to learn with my mother said to her, I guess my mother found out that she was taking carving from Robert Davidson. So my mother said to Isabel, look, Haidas do one thing. If they do one thing good, they stay with it. And either you weave or you carve. You can't do both. So Isabel became a great weaver. She's world renowned for her weaving. Then Raven's Tail really got going, and the Totem Heritage Center decided to have a gathering of Raven's Tail weavers. And this was in, I think it was anybody there here in the audience? I think it was like, I can't remember. I'll have to look it up. I had it in my notes. I should have looked at my notes, but I'm not using them. Anyway, we started a robe there, and I don't know if I have a picture of, I don't think I have a picture of this collection, in these slides, but Evelyn Vanderhoop, who was with me in Ottawa when I got the fellowship and to study at the British Museum, I received an international fellowship from the National Endowment of the Arts, and it was only $2,000. I didn't know how I was going to stay there for 6 weeks on $2,000 when I had to rent a place, and I thought maybe I wouldn't eat. But anyway, it ended up that when I got there, I had to go see Dr. George MacDonald, who is the director of the Canadian Museum of Civilization. And when I told him I only had $2,000, he said, oh, we'll make you a fellow of the museum. And they gave me $20,000, so I was able to stay there. So very fortunate. All these people were so supportive. And Evelyn saw this cut up robe. She thinks one was in Ottawa, the other one was in Toronto. We didn't know this fellowship would let me travel around, or we would have really gone to Quebec and Vancouver, but we only found out the week before that I could have traveled. So I didn't use the whole fellowship. But there she is, starting the weaving of the piece that she studied. Whoops. Uh-oh, went too far back. So there it is, and that's the piece that she just took a section of that, and she finished it. It's an apron, but that's the beginning of it. And that's why it's so important to be able to go to different museums to study, because it really gives you a great idea of what is available and what was made. This is a robe that Cheryl made, and that's at the Egan Library. And already Raven's Tail was taking a different turning. It was amazing, because she used She used merino for the warp, but she used silk for the weaving. So people were not staying to traditional once they knew they were going beyond what was made in the beginning, the 11 robes that were available to study. And they were going even further. This is one that is in the museum in Philadelphia. But my daughter Evelyn, after she took Chilkat or Raven's Tail weaving, she made that for David Boxley, and it's actually a beaded blanket with the Raven's Tail trim. And this one's at the Egan Library. Some of you have probably seen it. It was one of the 1% commissions. The top is spider web, then the Seasons on the Mountains, and then the Simpson was lightning, and it's the Dora Bolton design. And that's the first robe that was made probably in maybe 150 years. This was at Cheryl's studio, and Ernestine Hanlon and myself and Cheryl, well, we were complaining all the time because we were there to study Chilkat weaving, and we kept saying, why are we doing this? We never heard of it. And then she was writing her monograph, and finally she got sick and tired of us yelling at her. I think after the box in the boxes, she let us go. So she finished it up. But it's really a valuable piece because Cheryl worked on it, and Ernestine and myself. First one made in at least 150 years. And that's one that I'm doing for a collector, and my daughter Evelyn helped me get it started. We did the warp. I thought we would finish spinning the warp like in 1 week. It took us 2 weeks working from 6 in the morning till 10 at night. Our knees were raw. Those of you who are weavers know what we mean. And then after I did that robe for the collector, he wanted a tunic. Well, I thought I made the first tunic, and I was really thrilled. Here I look at these old paintings by these Russian collectors, and there's an Aleut with a Raven's Tail robe on. So I think the Aleuts were doing Raven's Tail robe, because I saw another one with that was there. Either that or they collected from the Tlingit. And then we have a wearable art show in Ketchikan, and Holly made this outfit for my grandson to wear at the wearable art show. And it was a lot of fun seeing it. And when a robe is finished, because the robe has a spirit, we have to honor that spirit. And because I didn't know it was just going to hang or what was going to happen to it, I asked Robert Davidson if he would dance it at Celebration. And because you can't just ask someone to dance, you have to pay them. And I asked him how much, and he didn't want to say, but I did a headband, and at that time I was charging $1,000 for a headband, so I asked him if that was okay if I gave him this headpiece that I had finished. And so he said okay, so it's in his collection now. And I've made several of these, and one is at the 1% commission at the Anchorage Airport, and then I think the collector that bought the robe, he doesn't like his name known, that's why I'm not telling you. He buys everything I make too. I don't want somebody else to go steal him away. And then my second apron was purchased by Dr. White. He's the orthodontist that's here. And when I commissioned the artist to do the board, the condition was that he had to see it at this point where I am right there, because if it wasn't good enough, he wanted his board back. So I brought it, and he said it was good, so I was able to finish it. And there it is. And that's in Dr. White's collection. I think it's for sale right now. I think he's selling it out of a gallery in Vancouver. I also want to emphasize how important your material is. And this picture is taken in Haida Gwaii. with people who have harvested basketry material, the spruce root, and they're cooking it. And not just women went. We always are glad when guys came along because they carried the wood, did the fire, did all the manly things. So it's really fun to have a man along. And we gather in the woods, and when we're gathering spruce roots or cedar bark, we always speak to the tree. My mother always said, we hope that you seed this area so that when my children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren come, there'll be cedar bark for them too, or spruce roots, whatever it was. And she always thanked the tree. When we were leaving, she'd thank the tree. And I think it's important to know that when preparing material, you have to know a lot more than just splitting the material. If you soften the cedar bark up, it just is easier to weave with, and a lot of people don't do that, and you'll see lumpy, bumpy baskets. And with spruce root, everything is, you have to split the roots. That's why there aren't many spruce root weavers, because there's no leather stripper like there is for the cedar bark, where you could use the leather stripper to make your pieces all even. With spruce root, it's just, you have to split it with your mouth, or some people do it with their legs. My sister-in-law, who's a beautiful weaver, just holds it between her knees. And I wanted to show this picture because I knew Janny was going to be here. And I wanted her to see the picture of her little girl and Janny. And now her grandchildren are even bigger than this. But Janny has taken every class that I've ever taught, if she's in town. And that's amazing. She's a wonderful weaver, a wonderful teacher, and I really appreciate that she's doing it and will keep on doing it. And then there were other people who were really instrumental in helping us. I'll never forget, we used to teach at the museum, and we always stayed with the people from the museum. And this one time, we got here, and I called the people from the different people from the museum, and nobody was here. I said, Mother, what shall I do? We can't afford to stay in a hotel. She said, call Mary Lou, because Mary Lou had taken a class previously, and she had told my mother, if you need a place, call me. And I said to Mother, Mother, white people say good morning, good night, how are you? And they don't mean it. And when they say, come to my place, they're just being polite. And she said, call Mary Lou. So I called Mary Lou, and when I said, Mary Lou, we're here, she said, are you at the airport or at the ferry terminal? So she came and got us. So we stayed with her a lot after that. She and her husband are so gracious, and they've been wonderful supporters of the art. They were instrumental in getting Janny to teach the classes at the university. So all along the way, many people have supported us in our weaving endeavor. And there's that beautiful hat that Janny wove and is now on the Kennecott. And there it is without the painting. It's exquisite and just a beautiful hat. And many people, like I mentioned, helped us along the way. I mentioned Flora Mather and my mother, who were the first ones who taught me. And then it was really sad. I was wishing that people would do a video of Ida Kadashan weaving, because they all wove just a little different. The woman I learned from in Sitka was, she wove a little different. And so I think the different clan mothers wove differently. So I think that it's too bad we didn't get all those clan mothers with their weaving style before they died. But weavers now are just not just doing traditional weaving. This piece was made by the students. One of my students that, I don't know if she gave me permission to use her name, so I'm not going to use it. She wove this basket, and it has Chilkat and has raven's tail. but I really like the checkerboard design because I was reading in a book that, in fact, I think it was Emmons' book where he wrote that the Tlingits were really miffed when they saw white people playing checkers because they thought they invented the game and they weren't too happy about people playing checkers. And I found out that they used to use like chessmen, like chess. They had little carved figures that they used for their checkers. I'd love to have seen the little carved pieces. But they probably, you know, a lot of the things that people made were so precious, and they put their spirit into it, so they would destroy them when they died. It's just like when my stepdad died. He had this drum that they first started dancing with when they started their dancing, and my aunt Roseanne Elmore burned it on the beach. And so it was not uncommon for Tlingits to burn everything of their relatives that were kind of personal things, like their clothing. And this is another weaver from Huna, and I really don't want to use their names without their permission. And she is an excellent weaver. Her husband is a carver. But Sealaska's sponsored these classes, and I just can't thank them enough for how we started off with 20 weavers. We've ended up with 7, but they are very dedicated. They went to Washington, D.C. and studied baskets in their collection, and they're planning another trip. They really are wonderful, and one of them, Darlene C., is teaching in the schools. There's also other people who are doing other things, like Diane Willard incorporates the raven's tail weaving, and she does it, she's got yellow cedar bark, but then when she gets up to the top, she's using wax linen for her designs. So much easier to weave with wax linen. Then, when I found out about this hat, actually it was a newspaper article, and it told about these people who were hunting and found this man that was frozen in the glacier. And they showed a picture of the archaeologist landing to study the body and retrieve it. But the first thing they saw, because they were coming in on a helicopter, the hat blew up in the air. Well, right away, I'm thinking, I want to replicate that hat. Well, I contacted the Champagne Asiatic, and they really didn't want me to come. So I contacted Rosita Laurel, and I got funding to go up and study it. And I was telling the village of Klakwan about it. So they said, oh, they wanted to learn about that hat. And so I got a letter from the organized village of Klakwan to go and study the hat, and I would come back and teach them. The university said they would sponsor me to teach the class. Well, when I started out on my journey, I was in Haines, and here was Ruth Casco, and she said, I'm here to be with you. And I thought she meant just at the ferry terminal. Then she said, I've got my van, I'm taking you to Skagway, and we're going up over the pass. So she came with me. And when we got into the museum in Whitehorse, the chiefs were all there. And because I had taught to be respectful, I went over and introduced myself. Ruth just nodded to them and walked over to the hat. And then when I got through introducing myself, she hollered out at me, Delores, get over here. We only have one day here. I was really happy she did that, because I think they were going to refuse me to have me study that hat. Because even now, Jerry Williams, who is also has the same DNA, amazingly, I had the same DNA, the guy that they found in the glacier. And Jerry Williams also has that DNA. And they wouldn't let her go study it last summer. So they're really keeping it they're not wanting people to study it. I did go and study it again, but I replicated the hat, and it auctioned for, I thought it would auction for $7,800, but it actually auctioned for $15,000. And there's Ruth. I wanted to show Ruth, and we're doing the replicating the hat, and there's her cousin Edith. I'm sorry, I can't remember Edith's last name. What is it? Oh, Jacko. Okay. Yeah, so they were the first ones that, and Lorraine Casco actually finished her hat and gave it to her uncle. And I thought you might want to see one of my mother's hats. I don't know if this one is in the museum in Juneau or in Ketchikan. She made two of them, and one, and you know, amazingly, she wove this hat in 1 week. She always got all her material. She was really organized. She had all her material ready. I don't know of anyone who has ever finished a spruce root hat other than my mother in 1 week. But the hat on the right-hand side, when I was in Madrid studying men's armor, and there I found out women didn't do armor. The Spanish were really told me, women don't do armor. But I took the pictures anyway of the armor. And so they showed me this hat that was collected by Juan Perez in 1774, just off the coast of the Queen Charlotte Islands. He couldn't land because it was too stormy, but they did, the native people did come out and bring gifts, and this was one of them, and that was the spruce root hat. And they're not very much different than they were when they collected in 1774. And we're still finding old baskets, and I really appreciate that we have that. This man who was an archaeologist, he was fishing off of Thorn River, and he saw that piece that's on the left-hand side. Now, you and I fishing, I don't think we'd recognize that as a basket, but he did. And even though it was in the tidal zone, he couldn't touch it because he either was federal employee and the basket was on state land. Anyway, he couldn't touch it, so he had to go back to Craig, and then they had to come back. But they were very fortunate they were able to get it out. And there's Janny cleaning it. And then the museum bought my replication of the basket. And you know, when I saw it when it was in a big chunk, and it wasn't really that big. And so and because the warp was thick, thin, not because of being in the tide, but just that's the way they were. And because it was S-twist, I really think it was a Simpson basket, and so I made the trim Simpson. And when the museum bought this basket, I said to Steve, I don't want that to represent me 100 years from now. You better buy a good basket. So they bought the other basket too. So, and I thought, I'm finishing up with my mother. My mother was really an amazing person. I mean, she helped my father establish Native Brotherhood in Canada, and she also was a treasurer in Ketchikan, was very involved in sisterhood. But she also was involved, didn't leave when she left Haida Gwaii, the Queen Charlotte's. She still went back there whenever she could, and here she is meeting the Queen of England at Queen Charlotte on Haida Gwaii. And it was the Queen, when she came off the plane, these white dignitaries were trying to make them go to the white dignitaries. She just walked right over to the matriarchs and met them. She was very gracious. Then I saw this canoe at the Canadian Museum of Civilization. Then I remembered that I had a picture of the canoes coming in here. These are Haida canoes when they came from Haida Gwaii. And so I thought, wow, that was being renewed too, the art of carving canoes, and that's so exciting. Then, I wanted to end it with Joe Williams, because he's the one that kept the Cape Fox dancers dancing and really working. And I'll never forget when they were dancing and I was still working at the hospital, I went to him and I told him, I said, Mrs. Denny is in the hospital. She has Alzheimer's, but she knows these old songs and she's singing Tlingit songs. So he went up and every day he'd go there and sing with her, and he learned a lot of the really old songs from this woman that had Alzheimer's. And that's one thing I really admired about the Native people. I was at the first gallery I worked at was at the Nelson Gallery, and the dancers were from Kasan. They had an old, very old man with them. He probably was younger than I am. I'm 83. But anyway, he was there, and it was amazing. He was dancing and singing with them. They did not turn away people with Alzheimer's. They kept them living in the community. And I think that was really an important lesson for me. I also have a basket story I want to read to you. And I'm ending it with this. A woman at Kloak was just finishing a basket when she died. She had not yet cut off the tops. Then her husband took the basket and put it up under the roof over his bed. He thought a great deal of it because it was his wife's last work. Sometimes he would take it down, press it against his heart, and weep as he held it there. He wept all the time. After this man had been a widower a long time, he married again. One evening when he was sitting on the bed playing with his new wife, the basket fell over his head. He tried to pull it off, and his wife laughed, not knowing why it had been up there. When he was unable to pull it away, his wife also tried, but it stuck tight around his neck. He became frightened and worked very hard at it. Suddenly, the basket said to him, "Yes, pull me off of your head. Why don't you? Why don't you press me against your heart again?" At last, if they had not cut the basketry warp, the basket would have choked him to death. Then he put it farther back, and in the morning threw it into the fire. That's it.
I think we have maybe time for one question or two if you're willing to work.
Sure.
I don't have a question, but I just have to say that we have to thank Delores. We have to thank Delores for all that she's done for us. First of all, it's just wonderful to see your mother again, and also old friends like Joe Williams. Joe Williams is a Shango Crady, and so his children are my grandchildren, and it's good to see all of our old friends again. But Delores, I want you to know, is responsible for our Tlingit spruce root basketry surviving. This basketry was almost extinct. We only have a couple of women who know how to make it. And we persuaded her to come and teach the Tlingit women how to make spruce root basketry. And she would always try to shame us and say, we need to have a Tlingit woman that could teach it instead of a Haida woman. But if it were not for Delores, it would probably have disappeared. So we Tlingit ladies and we Tlingit people owe her a great debt. And if all the Tlingits would stand with me to thank her. Thank you, Delores.
Thank you very much.